Welcome back into Yahoo Finance Live as we enter an interesting chapter here, both for the markets and for the economy as a whole. Plus, for companies out there trying to navigate the return to the office amidst the spread of Delta on the COVID front. And as we've seen, Delta Airlines started an interesting strategy here to charge unvaccinated employees an extra $200 when it comes to healthcare. Also trying to deliver on what President Biden has called for when it comes to private and public companies stepping up to help in vaccination efforts and incentives there. And for more on that, I want to bring on Rich Lesser, Boston Consulting Group CEO, joins us right now. And Rich, it's good to be chatting with you again here, specifically about kind of, I guess, the role that companies need to be playing here. It's a bit tricky, whether you're bringing employees back into the office or not, but clearly playing a larger role here when it comes to incentivizing vaccinations.
So could we start by grounding ourselves in what's going on with Delta right now? Because I really don't think it sets the stage for what companies need to do. The Delta variant is just much more transmissible than the earlier variants that came through, 2.5 to 3 times more transmissible than the wild strain that we were all talking about when COVID first hit. And as a result, it's running through communities dramatically. It may also be more severe in addition to being more transmissible. It's less clear on. But the result is enormous impact. So let me just highlight a couple things that are really important. First, we now have data from multiple states around the country and from the CDC. If you are vaccinated, age adjusted, so like for like age, you're about 20 times less likely to end up in the hospital than if you are unvaccinated. And that's true whether you're in a state with a lot of infection right now or a state with relatively low infection. The second thing that's true is that communities can protect themselves. If you take the states that are in the top 12 of vaccination and you compare it to the states that are in the bottom 12 of vaccination, the infection rates by age group are about 4 to 5 times worse in the more infected states than they are in the less infected state. I mean, in the more vaccinated states, you have about 1/4 or 1/5 of the infection rates that you do in the low vaccination states. So it's enormous impact to protect our communities. And what it means is if you're vaccinated, in most parts of the country, it's at or below what it feels like in peak flu season. In many parts of the country, way below peak flu season. And if you're unvaccinated, it's dramatically worse than it was last winter. Now that brings us to companies. Companies are realizing this and public sector, and we need to protect people to a greater degree, and we need to raise the cost of being unvaccinated. And we see a range of actions designed to do that.
Yeah, and I wonder too, I mean, in your discussions with business leaders here, so much of this have been focused in on cases, right? That was kind of the number we were watching here. But to your point, people out there, even if you are vaccinated, might get COVID. But the experience is far better than what could have happened if you weren't. I would be case in point. I was a breakthrough infection down for a few days, but still, it wasn't impacted that much. And when we look at maybe how businesses might be reacting to that, we keep hearing more and more timelines getting pushed back in terms of when, if there is an office still, when they'd be going back in. So what are you hearing maybe in terms of how companies maybe be shifting away from the earlier rules around cases in the office and what maybe the hybrid model is still looking like now?
So first of all, I just want to reinforce your point. We focus much more on hospitalization rate than we do on infection rate. We don't spend our lives talking about who got a cold or who got a very mild symptom flu. You talk about where it's serious and where people's lives are at risk or you're taking up valuable hospital capacity. So that is an important thing to think about right now. I think most companies are doing 2 things. One is they're upping the cost for being unvaccinated. Some have gone to full mandates. Some have gone to paying for part of your health care. The Delta Airlines announcement from Ed Bastian thought was quite interesting and important in the way they framed it for their employees. Some are going to a vax or test even twice a week or every day, as well as wearing masks in the office. So we're trying to raise the cost of being unvaccinated. And the second is, in many cases, it's leading to a pushback of when you can get people back into the offices. I think all of us are trying to get our people back together as fast as we can. May not be full time, 5 days a week, but to get our community sort of reconnected. But Delta's slowing that down. And, then you see varying rates of how people do that, whether make it more voluntary to come back in or actually just be very clear that they're going to slow it happening. for me right now, job one is all around vaccination and everything we can do to encourage it. And employers have a big role to play, but for sure the government has an even bigger role to play at state and local as well as federal levels.
Yeah, the roles on the local level here very different depending on which state you're in there in terms of how some of these restrictions are going to be implemented here. But just lastly, I mean, when we think about where we are in this recovery, you were just listening to before we got on here live. We were listening to the discussion there with Philadelphia Fed President Patrick Harker, focusing in on the supply and demand issues here, saying that a lot of what we're seeing right now is more of a supply issue. And I do wonder your take when we look at growth coming out of this, if we do see a pushback in timeline of getting back to normal and costs continue to saddle some of these companies when you think about the healthcare costs associated with COVID, what you think about maybe how this recovery is going, what it'll look like in the next quarter or two?
I still remain very optimistic about the economic recovery that's underway. Individual sectors and individual communities could well be impacted by Delta, but what we've seen through the really effective policy actions by the Fed, by the federal government, by others around the world, we've decoupled the ability to be economically vibrant from the impact of COVID. The fastest way to get back onto full steam growth ahead is, of course, to get beyond COVID. But actually, the underlying growth prospects remain very good for the economy. We're dealing with the supply challenges right now, supply of labor, supply of goods. Your last conversation highlighted both of those, and they're very real. So I'm not minimizing the disruptive nature in the short term, but the underlying growth prospects, I and we remain very confident around.
I like to leave it on a positive note, so we'll leave that there. Rich Lesser, Boston Consulting Group CEO, appreciate you coming back on to chat. Have a great weekend, sir.